Welcome, everybody. Welcome from Brussels. A good evening to the EU participants and good afternoon to the participants from the United States. My name is Reinhard Bütikofer. I'm a German Green Member of Parliament. I'm your host for this webinar about transatlantic cooperation of connectivity strategy. And I have been the European Parliament's rapporteur on the EU's connectivity strategy that was adopted this January. I'm extremely happy to have a marvelous panel that I will introduce to you in a second, and a great group of participants from the public sector on either side of the Atlantic, from business, from diplomatic representations, from think tanks, and from the media. And I want to thank my team, in particular Isabel Guzman, who have been doing the prep work for this webinar. Let me start by quoting President Biden. Just a few days ago, while we had already been preparing this webinar, he gave presidential attention to our topic by expressing his concerns over China's Belt and Road Initiative, and by saying, and I quote, "I suggested we should have essentially a similar initiative, pulling from the democratic states, helping those communities around the world that in fact need help," end of quote. Well, we have about an hour to hear from our panelists what they think the EU and the US can contribute to President Biden's call. Each one of them will have 10 minutes to present their ideas, and whatever time will be left then, we can use for Q&A. Some people have already sent in questions, and I do hope that we will be able to take at least a few of them. Please do use the chat function or the Q&A function later. Now to the panel. Representative Andy Kim will speak first, then Director General Koen Doens, then Director General Petra Sigmund, and then Jonathan Hillman. Congressman Andy Kim was first elected to the US House of Representatives in 2018 from the 3rd Congressional District of New Jersey. He serves on the House Armed Services Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and the House Committee on Small Business. Prior to serving in the House, he had a public service career under both Democrats and Republicans. He served at USAID, at the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House National Security Council, and in Afghanistan as an advisor to Generals Petraeus and Allen. Director General Koen Doens has been the Director General of the DG International Partnerships of the European Commission since October 2019. He has also worked as Director of EU-African Union relations and in other functions in the European institutions. Before entering the European institutions, Mr. Doens worked as a Belgian diplomat, e.g. as counselor in charge of transatlantic relations. He has worked on Russia and Eastern Europe, the OSCE, United Nations, WTO, terrorism, in the cabinets of Belgian foreign ministers De Gucht and Michel. He also served at Belgian embassies in Moscow, Tehran, and Damascus. And what I like best about his CV, he's been a professor of Latin and Greek. Greek used to be my favorite subject in school. Petra Sigmund is the Director General for East Asia in the German Foreign Ministry. Asia, East Asia, South Asia, and the Pacific. Since 2017. She studied sinology, political science, and economics in Berlin and Beijing. From 2004 to 2006, she directed the Trade Promotion Office at the German Embassy in Beijing. Later, she worked at the German Embassy in Paris and held various posts at the Federal Foreign Office in Berlin. And Jonathan Hillman is a senior fellow with the CSIS Economics Program and director of the Reconnecting Asia project, one of the most extensive open source databases tracking China's Belt and Road Initiative. He has testified before Congress, briefed governments, and Fortune 500 executives. He writes on economics, national security, and foreign policy issues for a number of major news outlets. He is the author of 2 books on China. Okay, enough of my introduction. Let's not waste time. And welcome again, Congressman Kim. Great to have you. It is your turn now. Please take the floor for your remarks.
Sure, thank you. Well, thank you so much for pulling this together. I want to thank my fellow panelists. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and for us to stay in touch about this going forward, as there's a lot to be done. As mentioned, my name is Congressman Andy Kim. I represent a district in New Jersey. I first got elected in 2018 and recently reelected. Prior to my time in Congress, I worked for the United States Department of State, working in diplomacy, as mentioned, and I was trained in international relations from a UK school, and just really has focused a lot and my time out in Afghanistan was embedded and based on a NATO military base. So I've seen this transatlantic relationship in many different ways, and it's been such a key part of the work that I've done. And I think that this is going to be essential for what it is that we're trying to accomplish going forward. I want to just pause though and just reflect back over the last year. A year ago, my state of New Jersey, my country, we were the epicenter of the COVID pandemic. My state was so hard hit between New York, New Jersey very early on. We fought the virus, we fought the broken supply chains, and tried to do everything we can to keep life-saving personal protective equipment flowing to our frontline healthcare workers and basic goods to our grocery stores. We fought the insufficient and unreliable internet that made things incredibly difficult for our kids to study from home. And as a father of 2 baby boys, I can attest to that firsthand. It was incredibly difficult, and it still remains difficult for so many people. I'm continuing to hear from seniors in my community about the struggles that they've had with connectivity and so many other issues that we face. We see that anxiety that is across our societies, and I'm sure you see that disruption and the anxiety that is caused by that in your own communities as well. To the questions about how we build our communities back after this virus goes away and we're left up, on how we pick up the pieces going forward, which is such a critical part of that. These are questions that are not unique to my community, and they're not only being asked here in New Jersey or in the United States. The question of how we rebuild in the post-COVID era is truly global. It's reminiscent to the questions we asked during other periods of great paradigm shifts in our global order, like the period after September 11th or after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We are in this new era here where we know that the world that we will be opening back up to is going to be different than the world that we socially distanced from last year. And these questions demand us to take stock in our values and our priorities. And they are questions that require us to confront our goals and commit to a kind of action that can make them truly achievable. Even as we're still suffering through this pandemic, the answers to the questions that will define the post-pandemic era are being formulated. The question that those of us today are charged with answering is, how are we going to reconnect to build a world ready to take on the defining challenges of that new era? What I'd like to talk about today is how we can do that by strengthening the transatlantic cooperation on connectivity strategy, the importance of leading with a set of shared values, and a warning about losing the battle of telling our story. Let me start by just defining this new era. We can call it a post-COVID era, but to do so misses the point. COVID-19 isn't just a virus, it's a truly transnational problem. And it is, in a lot of ways, our first truly global crisis, which has exposed the gaps in connectivity that leave many of the people that I represent, that many of my colleagues represent, that many of you represent, vulnerable of falling through the gaps. I bring this up because it's important to remember that connectivity starts at home. It's a policy that literally links us together. In order for us to aggressively pursue it and decisively achieve it, we must understand how it impacts our own communities and seek to understand its impacts abroad. It's that impact, that truly transnational impact, that requires the kind of cooperation we're here to talk about today. It's been a little more than 80 days since Joe Biden was sworn in as president of the United States. President Biden is someone who ran and won on talking about those issues that impact people at home. But what we've seen from his administration, from people like Secretary Blinken or National Security Advisor Sullivan, and once confirmed USAID Administrator Power, is an understanding that you can't solve transnational problems by simply stating America first. You can only do it through transnational solutions. Over the last 4 years, there was progress made in establishing and articulating the beginning of a coherent U.S. connectivity strategy. The establishment of the Development Finance Corporation through the BUILD Act has more than doubled the previous funding caps for investment and brought together opportunities that have had incredible impact in the projects throughout the globe. The Blue Dot Network has helped establish standards for infrastructure projects to ensure that when we build according to our values. And the Clean Network shows that the same values can apply to the 21st century digital infrastructure as they can to the traditional definitions we often think of. But these individual components do not articulate a full and clear vision of a U.S. connectivity strategy. They demand, as we often say, the need to put, as Mr. Budakofer says, the wheels on the car and a destination to drive towards. We can do that by using the collective effort of building strong connectivity strategies to serve as a basis for re-strengthening the US-EU alliance. And conversations like this are necessary first steps in exploring ways to work closer together to achieve our common goals. I call on the Biden administration to take the basis of what we build today and engage in conversations to find areas of agreement and opportunity. As we seek out those areas of agreement in connectivity strategies that will build the foundation to address the challenges of this new era, it's critical that we do so under a shared set of values. Moments of systemic change, like the one we're in now, can often cut both ways. They can provide an opportunity for transparency, equity, sustainability, and cooperation, but they can also lead to the adoption of the worst impulses of governance, authoritarianism, segmentation, and corruption. Connectivity strategy isn't just about strengthening our networks that tie us to one another. It's about defining what those networks look like and the kind of world they create. By working together, we can show the world that our common values are their common values. And we can show the world that the common transnational threats that challenge us all are solvable through and only through transnational solutions. And we can define an era of opportunity and cooperation that we can be truly proud of. So again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts and sort of the trajectory that I'd like to see our conversations moving towards as we strengthen this going forward. And in the meantime, we'll again look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists and the questions to come. So with that, I'll turn it back. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Congressman Kim, for your insights and for sharing them with us. And without further ado, I turn now to Director General Koen. Please give us your remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Reinhard, and really a pleasure and an honor to be here with you, and with the fellow panelists, of course. And I'll maybe start with just a few remarks, starting from a point which Congressman Kim made, which is that we are indeed living in times that signal or that are marked by a real change of paradigm. The congressman referred to 9/11, referred to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I think those are very relevant references. And what we also know is that in those times like that, almost everything is geopolitics. And then came COVID-19, which to a certain extent acted really as an accelerator of what was already emerging before. And the amazing thing is that basically at a time when the world's challenges need a world to come together, that actually we've seen a trend towards fragmentation, competition taking hold. And so the big question now indeed is, as we build back better, what does it mean, the better? And I think that on the side of Europe, we have come up with a rather clear agenda on what better means, captured in our, let's say, flagship ideas, the Green Deal as a really a recovery strategy that is respectful of the needs to go towards zero carbon by 2050 and to protect biodiversity, and a digital agenda that is fundamentally human-centric. And so the real issue is, how do we embrace this twin transition of climate and digital in a way that allows us to build societies that are strong, resilient, inclusive, and fundamentally democratic. The connectivity agenda is obviously a central part of that, because when we say connectivity in our globalized world, what are we talking about? Obviously, we're talking about transport connectivity, we're talking about energy, we're talking about digital connectivity, and we're talking about people to people. And we're looking at it through two dimensions. There's the hard stuff, the hardware, and there's, very importantly, the software, the whole governance and regulatory setup. Now, what does that mean? Basically, as we develop our ideas and our strategy for Build Back Better, we need to strengthen and to bring the clarity of purpose and of our political narrative more to the fore. I really think that we should not be reactive, but that we should start from our own strength. And I think that with the new administration in the United States, there's a huge opportunity to build a stronger transatlantic agenda, because I see that even if we do not see eye to eye in detail on each and every point, there's a great potential for synergies. We have a story to tell, we have a model to develop, and I think that at the core of that model fundamentally lies the idea, it's an ugly word, of sustainability. The fact that what we do now is set in the present, but it is future-proof, and that makes us maybe different from a number of other partners. I sometimes use, I sometimes say that the real question is, do you want it fast or do you want it to last? And I think that that's the bet we make. It's a bet on sustainability. And that translates into the way in which we do connectivity. Now, as we roll out that vision, that strategy, that agenda across our connectivity agenda, both through investment in hardware and investment in the soft side, the software of things, of course, all of that needs to be backed up by sizable funding. And I think that when it comes to funding, Europe acting as Team Europe, so the European Union and the member states, start from a very, very strong basis. I mean, we are the biggest providers of official development aid. Over the, in 2019, we provided 75.2 billion in ODA, Team Europe that is, and member states plus the EU. So we've got quite a lot of firepower, which is grant funding. If we now combine that with the strength of our private sector and the foreign direct investments, we combine that with our trade relations, and we combine that with a strong policy dialogue and a normative angle to it, then I do think we have what it takes to design an influential, impactful connectivity agenda across those various areas that matter. And if we team up on this with the United States of America, and Congressman Kim has highlighted a number of the American strengths also, and a number of innovations in the US's development architecture, then I think potentially we can make a very strong joint offer. As I've said, that will not always be identical, and there are divergences of views, but I see many more overlaps than divergences, to be clear. Third element I wanted to make is the geographic angle of this. We are obviously very much focused on Asia, on Indo-Pacific, and we will soon come up with ideas with council conclusions on the Indo-Pacific, and we are working in the institutions on a joint strategy paper, a joint communication on the Indo-Pacific. But it is as important to do that as well in other parts of the world. Obviously, Africa is on the top of our mind and our agenda in Europe, and we are working on a strategic analysis of important connectivity corridors between Europe and Africa. I think there's a lot of space there as well to team up with the United States and see where we can work together. Something similar, very much true, of course, for Latin America and the Caribbean, where we are also increasing our presence when it comes to connectivity, starting with, of course, the fact that we have extremely strong trade and investment relations between Europe and Latin America, but also in the digital agenda. We will now, in June this year, have an operational high-speed fiber optic cable that connects Europe to Latin America, Bella, which will really allow us to embark on a much stronger partnership with them on the whole data economy, connecting research and education networks, and use and maximize the use of what we can bring through our EU space programs like Copernicus. So there as well, we're building a strong hardware backbone for linking up connectivity-wise, to which we can then add the software, the regulatory reform, and the governance. So what I see across the globe, whether in Asia, in Latin America, or in Africa, backed up by a certain vision of where we want to go with the world when it comes to Build Back Better, a very strong basis for the EU agenda and for a strong transatlantic partnership to drive this transformational agenda with our partner countries. Thank you very much. I'll stop there and very much looking forward to the rest of the debate. Back to you, Reinhard.
Thank you very much for that, Director General. And now I turn to Petra Sigmund in Berlin. Welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Reinhard, and also thank you for putting up this interesting panel. We've had an angle of connectivity and why it is important to engage in connectivity for our governments to rebuild after COVID, to ensure functioning systems, functioning networks. We had an angle on what exactly the values and the principles should be and where we need to engage. And my angle that I want to bring in is actually from an Asia point of view, the systemic competition with China angle, because us Asia-China people, we look at this connectivity strategy as a possible instrument in our systemic competition with China. Now, this systemic competition with China is global, it's everywhere, it's in Asia, it's in fact in Europe, it's in Africa, it's in Latin America, and it uses economic means to create financial and economic dependencies and political alignment with China. And the Chinese, they use the fact that they've discovered this huge gap in infrastructure finance all over the world, infrastructure finance needs that are not being responded to by the international community or the international banks. And China is there, ready to finance infrastructure, ready to finance recovery after COVID, but not according to standards that are our standards. So they've discovered this gap and they're there. And in order for us to be able to enter into this competition, which starts with economic project, but it ends with, whose candidates are we going to have in United Nations sub-organizations. It starts with who builds this bridge, but it ends with how many countries support Chinese visions on human rights. So it's important for us to realize the competition that we're in with China is not just about, infrastructure and economics. It's about political influence in this world. It's about upholding the principles of this rules-based international order that has been built after the Second World War that we all cherish and want to uphold. So it's important that we enter in this competition, us Europeans, and that we make an attempt at least at outcompeting China in this area and offer our own means, financial means, programs to fill in this gap that many countries feel in. Who provides us with assistance for economic recovery after COVID? Who can finance for us infrastructure in data, in transportation, in energy? Who is there when we need it most? So for us, it's important to understand that this connectivity policy is, of course, about giving possibilities for infrastructure, giving access to finance, but it is in fact also a means for systemic competition with China. It's important to understand that and to also put this connectivity policy and strategy in this context. Now, we need to make clear when we provide for connectivity that our standards are internationally accepted standards. They are fulfillable standards. They're not non-fulfillable standards. It's about accepting the legal framework of the country that receives a loan or a donation that must be observed. In other words, no corruption, no bribery, no violation of people's participation rules. We support transparent bidding principles to be upheld. So in other words, no hands-free contracts for companies or builders. We do insist on environmental and international labor standards being upheld, being observed when building a project. In other words, no undercutting competitors by damaging the environment or workers' rights. We do look at debt sustainability before we hand out loans, preventing a country from losing possession of its infrastructure in the future. And we do insist on serving the interests of the country receiving the project. They must in fact be put front and center. In other words, local companies must be involved, not just the companies of the countries giving the loan for the infrastructure. Local workers need to be trained and need to be employed. So that are part of the standards that we want to uphold when we engage in infrastructure finance around the world. We think those standards should be attractive and fulfillable by most of the countries that we are making offers to when it comes to our connectivity policy. And now we need to make sure that the funds are there for this great task, because the needs are tremendous, especially now after COVID. They have been tremendous before COVID already, because as I said, there is this huge infrastructure finance gap that the Chinese have rightly discovered, one has to say so. So we need to bring the funds to the policy, EU institutions, together with EU member states, together with international partners that are like-minded, that cherish the same rules and standards. And there, of course, US is a great partner. Japan is a partner that we've approached. India is a partner that we're in a process of approaching. We're approaching ASEAN. So we're looking for and of course, private finance needs to be approached also, because our government funds need to be leveraged by private funds coming on top of this. So if we all work together, team up, EU, US, Japan and others, we actually do have the means, the financial means to outcompete China and its Belt and Road strategy and see to it that the projects that we are supporting follow internationally accepted rules and standards. That's all we want, an alternative to Chinese funding for the countries in need of funding, especially after COVID. And I think teaming up in a transatlantic way we can get a very good head start for this policy if we actually work together on this, EU and US and others. But in the EU, we still need to do some homework because I think the geopolitical dimension of this connectivity strategy is not yet fully understood. The fact that it is in fact part of our overall China strategy, it's part of our strategy of how we systemically compete with China. I think adding this dimension to our connectivity policy will ensure more visibility for the policy. It will make it a recognizable part of our geopolitical action. So we should put this more in the center of our communication about the connectivity strategy, in the not the only aspect, but certainly an aspect not to be forgotten. And we need to start speaking about it and acting about this connectivity policy in a more offensive way. We, especially having come up with a policy in 2018, we now finally need to come up with a first project that we're actually funding Europe and its partners together according to transparent standards, so that the world believes that the offer is actually there, not just on paper or on labels or in intentions, but that there is actually that we actually have the clout and the will and the means to put those projects, those infrastructure funding projects into practice. So that's what's most needed, and we are as a German government, very happy about Reinhard Bütikofer's engagement in this area, about the European Parliament helping in a tremendous way, pushing governments to become more active and to see to it that we hopefully soon have tangible outcomes of this important policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra. Now, finally, after hearing voices from the legislative and the executive branches of government, we will hear the voice of science. I guess very few people know as much as you do about BRI, Jonathan Hillman, and you've also looked at the European connectivity reflections. So I'm very glad you're also joining us. Please give us your take.
Thanks so much, Reinhard, for organizing this and for including me in this really distinguished group. I have to agree with a lot of what's been said. I think when we're asking ourselves, what should this vision for connectivity be? This is we're ultimately asking, what kind of world do we want to live in? And there's a number of common challenges that connectivity touches: building back after the pandemic, climate change, inequality, and competition with China. As you pointed out, I've spent a lot of time studying China's Belt and Road Initiative, so that's what I'll focus on primarily here, because I think there's some urgency here. I think some of the risks that China's activities pose are no longer hypothetical. I think we're seeing adverse effects on the ground, and I think the pandemic has actually exacerbated some of those underlying conditions in the Belt and Road. So let me say a bit about what I've been seeing in terms of China's activities, and then a few thoughts too on the potential here, the real potential for a transatlantic vision for connectivity. So I think that there's been, I'm always hesitant to generalize about the Belt and Road because this is something that's happening in, or sometimes not happening in 140 countries. The local dynamics are really important. You have to look at individual projects. But having spent 5 years doing that, I think that there are a set of common concerns here. So, first is just the way in which a lot of these projects are done. the opaque deal-making nature. Deals are being made bilaterally behind closed doors. Contracts have unusual confidentiality clauses. And that, as was pointed out earlier, this has an appeal because it makes projects move faster, but it doesn't do so in a way that makes them last, right? It pushes a lot of risk further into the project cycle, pushes a lot of risk down the road. That opaque set of activities, it stokes corruption. It makes it more likely that projects that shouldn't get the green light are ultimately given the green light. Even as much as the world needs infrastructure, a poorly planned project destroys more value than it creates. So doing these projects wrong really comes with serious consequences. We've seen debt sustainability issues in a number of countries that have been very active borrowers from the Chinese. We see economic feasibility studies that are either ignored or done essentially as a box checking exercise. Contracts with clauses that exclude Chinese lenders from Paris Club and other collective restructuring efforts. We see environmental assessments that are done after the fact to justify a project. And we see digital insecurity too. I think this is a really important area that's becoming even more important in the aftermath of the pandemic. We see data centers being built with security features that are so outdated that you have to ask, if that's being done intentionally. You see untrusted vendors being used for wireless networks and other digital infrastructure. And as I mentioned, these are no longer hypothetical risks. We now see Montenegro struggling with a debt issue, a NATO ally, due in large part to irresponsible Belt and Road related projects. We see coal-fired power plants in Serbia that are having an impact on an adverse impact on climate change, and will continue to do so for decades unless something is done. So that's the type of world that's being built through the Belt and Road right now, and I think we need to understand that because there's some urgency here. But obviously, we can't just criticize what someone else is doing. We do need to think about providing alternatives. For many countries participating in the Belt and Road, China is not their country of first choice, their partner of first choice. In many cases, it's been their only choice to support a project that might not otherwise be supported. And so as we think about how to shape this transatlantic vision, this alternative, I think we want to think about some common principles. Some of that I think is already in the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. I think parts of it are there. I think an emphasis on transparency, an emphasis on sustainability, not only environmental, but also social sustainability, negating, controlling for social risk, as well as debt sustainability. And then having a secure connectivity is really important, especially when we're talking about a world that is even more dependent on digital infrastructure. I think there's really a long list of areas in which we could cooperate practically. I do think that the first step is to agree on the principles behind this joint vision. But I think there are opportunities to do projects in each other's markets, first of all, to have more examples of success to point to. I think there's opportunity for cooperation in third markets, increasing technical assistance and project planning assistance for countries as they are considering what projects to use, as they're considering what they want their development strategy to be. Those are really important, relatively small investments that can prevent some of the worst cases that we've seen. There's a whole range of opportunities for cooperation through multilateral institutions, whether that's the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, EBRD. Also opportunities for cooperation through the G7 and the G20, which has agreed to quality infrastructure principles. So let's talk about operationalizing those principles and enforcing them. Since everyone's, at least that group of countries, very important group of countries, has agreed to them. Let's hold each other accountable for those agreements. And then in the digital infrastructure space, I think that there's a set of opportunities for everything from joint R&D to funding to potentially scale promising technologies like Open RAN. And I think we should work together to develop secure and trustworthy alternatives for 5G. So, and one last area I'll mention here, I think it's really important and quite promising, given that it's an area of strength for both European and US companies and other companies from allied countries, is smart cities. China has an approach to building smart cities, often referred to as safe cities, which emphasizes the public security aspect. And the actual track record of those projects has been quite problematic, not only from a human rights perspective, but just from failing to deliver some of the economic benefits that have been promised. So I think there's a real opportunity here for, what would an allied smart city offering look like, or what would a set of standards for, an international best practice for smart cities look like? And I think in doing these types of efforts, look, this is not charity. I think there's a strong self-interest here. We do this right, and I think we, you begin to build the world that you want to live in, a world that's more prosperous, more secure, and a world that is also benefiting citizens on both sides of the Atlantic. So again, a lot of opportunities there for cooperation. I really applaud you, Reinhard, for pulling together this conversation now. It's a really important time to have this, and there's also some urgency here. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much also, Jonathan, for your contribution, and your remarks as panelists have already motivated people to ask a lot of questions. So I will read the first 7 questions to you. Please take notes, and then I will go back to the panel and ask you to pick the questions you would want to answer. The first question is from Patrice, who wrote this: is connectivity meant to be part of an EU-US Trade and Technology Council? Given that unfettered flows of data are mission critical to every single operation, either civilian or military, from the benign to the most sophisticated, given that cybersecurity breaches have sadly become a fixture of global connectivity, should a provision inspired by Article 5 of the NATO Atlantic Treaty be considered? That was from Patrice. Then Ardian wrote from Tirana in Albania. 2 questions. Is Western Balkans becoming the region where the EU and the US work together on joint connectivity projects? If so, given the role that the executive branch has in infrastructure project management and implementation, how can actors such as the European Parliament, the US Congress, and Western Balkans civil society organizations actively participate? And then a number of questions in the Q&A section. Financial means are available in order to compete with others. Do we need more planning or more pragmatism, asks Jan. Then Finbar from South China Morning Post asks this: this week again, the Montenegrin government had asked the EU to help it repay $1 billion Chinese loan for a highway project that was agreed under a previous government, but the EU says it will not do this. The EU does not repay loans of partners which they took from third parties. That was a quote. If the US and the EU wish to compete with China on infrastructure, does it need to use its own DFIs, refinancing options, and see things like this as opportunities? Next question from Roderick from the MERIX think tank. Thank you for these interesting and valuable inputs. A range of connectivity policies and partnerships exist, ranging from the Blue Dot Network, the EU's connectivity strategy, the Australia-Japan-United States Trilateral Infrastructure Partnership, and the Japan-EU Infrastructure and Connectivity Agreement. How do we quickly put an efficient, effective, and common connectivity approach into practice and avoid a hodgepodge of policies and approaches? Which initiatives do we need to expand and have other actors join, or do we need to create new initiatives? Then François Godemont from the French think tank Montaigne asks, the Chinese Montenegro highway loan reportedly had cost extending to the country's ceding territory if it can't repay the loan. One can think of a port at the terminus of both the road and a railway. What is the EU's best interest? Should it have taken on the moral hazard and repaid the loan to avoid this extreme situation in an accession country? And another question finally from Jan. What is the role for the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank? Should the EU participate in the context of its connectivity strategy, or will this put strain on the transatlantic aspect? These first questions, please pick which ones you want to tackle, and I start again with Congressman Kim, please.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciated hearing everyone's thoughts here, and then some of these questions. I'm going to try to fold some of my my reflections on my fellow panelists' comments into some of my comments here to this question. I think I'll take the question from Rod about the range of partnerships that we have right now. There is, you know, a range that was articulated there, and the questions about how do we do this quickly. Do we start with the existing structures, or do we need to think about some newer ones? And I think for my purposes, again, kind of folding in some of my thoughts, a couple things. First and foremost is that we need to showcase that not just that we have the tools, but that we have the follow through. And I think that that's a, you know, a question that we in the United States at least certainly have to really showcase right now, coming out from the last 4 years, is this question of what does the United States handshake mean right now? You know, what does that actually entail, and what kind of reliability comes with that handshake? And that is something that the Biden administration, Secretary Blinken, who I know is headed out to Brussels and the EU over the next couple of days, that's a lot of what we're trying to reestablish and really try to articulate that. And when we talk about America is back, when we talk about that, well, that is what we are trying to showcase, is that there's going to be this follow through, this reliability. But we certainly understand that there's, you know, there's you know a lot of folks around the world that are waiting and seeing what we do and how we engage. I do think because of that we need to make sure that we are moving quickly on that. You know, to Jonathan's point, right now the risks and the challenges we face demand urgency, especially vis-a-vis China. You know, I think that that's something Director Sigmund raised as well, is that we are in this moment right now that would have been a paradigm shift globally, even if we didn't have the pandemic. We were already entering this new era of global competition, great power competition, however you want to talk about it. And this is laid on top of that. So, you know, this is something that we're trying to engage in. I, for one, think that you know, kind of some of the points that I think that Jonathan mentioned as well are ones that I'd like to move on quickly here. I do think that it's important for us to get a couple of quick wins. That we need to talk through things and have that broader strategy, but this can't just be something where we pontificate at summits for the next 24 months. You know, we need to find a couple of areas that we feel like have greater areas of consensus and try to move quickly, demonstrate that we have that capability and that capacity, demonstrate that we have that resolve and ability to be able to work together in. And so that is something that I'd be interested in as a follow-on to this conversation. How, you know, what are some of those areas, and drawing upon the knowledge of the panel and others to be thinking about. I'm not opposed to new structures, but I want us to be careful there that yes, we are in a period where I do think that, you know, we can think about what new structures would look like, and certainly different paradigm shift moments in global international order has often brought about some new structures and new institutions. But I don't think that it necessarily demands it right out of the gate. And we can kind of see where some of the gaps are. Because right now, I do think the urgency of the matter is, and the speed with which we can deliver is so very important, because you know, we are entering into this with a lot of inertia coming in from the pre-COVID world that we still need to deal with on that front. So those are just a couple of my, you know, kind of initial thoughts here. And I want to make sure I leave time for everybody else to speak. So I'll just kind of bring it to a close there.
Thank you, Congressman. Kuhn, you're next.
Thanks, thanks a lot for the different interesting interventions and the questions. I mean, just a few thoughts. I mean, first of all, because a lot has been said, obviously, about China. I think when we talk about a connectivity strategy, it obviously happens in a geopolitical context, and as I've said, I fully agree. Everything we do these days is geopolitical. But I also think that a strategy has to start from its own strengths, and it cannot be reactive. I mean, Congressman Kim was advisor to General Petraeus and Allen, so he probably knows that better than me. A strategy is not reactive. It starts from a vision of one's own, and to be honest, I do think we have one. That brings me to my second point, which is, I agree, we probably do not need to multiply again strategies and then platforms to compare strategies and so on. I think that probably within all those strategic frameworks that have been that exist and that have been referred to, underneath lies a number of very concrete ideas, pipelines, things we want to do, and so on. And I think the time is probably ripe to start comparing notes. I mean, beyond the strategy lies tactics, and beyond the tactics like operations. And I think that probably comparing notes of who's intending to do what, where, and what we consider as being strategic investments or interventions that need to be done, I think that would be a very good and concrete starting point to go beyond the thinking and move into the action. Which brings me to a third point, which is speed. And I think that there might be an issue there because precisely because as Petra said, when we do certain things, we will make the proper analysis and assessment. We will look at the environmental side, we will look at the social side, and we will certainly look at the financial sustainability of investments. Now, that means that by definition, we end up being slower than those who intervene without looking at all those things, those who basically offload those aspects into, let's say, contractual obligations that end up with collateral. And so this is a real issue we will need to look at, which is how can the offer we make, which is a qualitatively higher one, still perform with sufficient speed so that the lack of speed doesn't become a handicap. Final point on the regional scope. I mean, several of you have referred to the Western Balkans. Obviously, for the EU, the Western Balkans is, I mean, it's our closest possible neighborhood, and we have a high stakes there and a very heavy investment, and that goes for the European Commission. Commissioner Varelli and DG NIR are very strongly invested in it. And as we enter into our new budgetary cycle, have been working very closely with partners in the Western Balkans on investment packages. And I guess that the same is true for the new American administration. So definitely there we might be looking at how we can mutually reinforce each other through the actions we do. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That gives remaining 4 minutes for Petra and Jonathan combined. So 2 minutes each, please. And then I will have 30 seconds to conclude. Petra, please.
Thank you. Quick wins is absolutely what we need. A certain thoroughness, of course, in making sure that we projects follow our rules is necessary, but it can't take too long. And if we've learned something in this COVID pandemic is how to act swiftly but thoroughly to make sure that action is actually being taken. So we need to get better here on the time procedures take. And I do think there is a lot of potential for improvement, still being able to act swiftly, but not selling out on our values and principles. More pragmatism instead of more planning. Aim should be to put something up, the quick win. The Montenegro and Western Balkan question, I want to take this one. I think Piraeus, Greece, we learned a lot over the past years on how China operates, and I think the Montenegro question needs to be put in a foreign policy and geopolitical framework and thoroughly discussed. And connectivity, part of Technological and Connectivity Council, yes, of course. It shows connectivity has many dimensions, but that dimension is certainly needs to be part of the transatlantic discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan, please.
Thanks. So let me just say something really briefly about the question that pointed out that there are these existing partnerships around connectivity. The Blue Dot Network, the EU's connectivity strategy, the Japan-EU Infrastructure and Connectivity Agreement. I think what's missing in that list, though, is a US-EU deeper set of cooperation on these issues. And so whether one of those gets expanded, that would be one way to do this rather than creating a separate thing. But I do think that there's a real opportunity there that didn't exist in the same way 2 years ago. I think there's both, a convergence around perception of, what the threat and the challenge is, as well as, more convergence on what our attractive alternative should include, including in environmental standards, for example. So I think that that's an important development. This question about Montenegro, I think is not, it's not unique to Montenegro. I think China's Belt and Road has been to some extent paved with moral hazard, and one of the most difficult things to do is to prevent projects that shouldn't actually be projects from happening if someone wants to pay for it. The political incentives are so aligned to allow things to proceed. So in Montenegro's case, we're talking about a project that had 2 feasibility studies that suggested it wasn't going to be viable, and done by a previous political leadership, right? So this is one of the challenges. The political timeline for accountability for projects rarely lines up with the actual timeline for the projects themselves. So I think it's a very tough challenge. I wouldn't rule out, some form of cooperation immediately. I think you can learn a lot from engagement, from having a seat at the table. So I would explore this, further before reaching a decision on it.
Thank you. That concludes our 1-hour exchange. I want to thank all the panelists, and I want to thank the audience. This has been an exciting hour for me. I hope it will not remain a one-off. I hope that we will find other fora for transatlantic exchange on the topic. I would, in concluding, make just 5 quick remarks. I think what we see is that there is political will on either side of the Atlantic to converge on this agenda. We want to build that on the basis of common values that reflect our vision of the world. We acknowledge that we need to move speedily. We want to have quick wins and not pontificate. And we should try to include parliaments and civil society organizations in the process, and not just the executive branch of government, and of course, the private sector also. Before I conclude, I want to acknowledge one person that has been in our audience today without taking the floor, like so many others, but she needs to be mentioned, and that's Ambassador Romana Vlahutin, who has been the most proactive person in the European External Action Service, pushing for the connectivity agenda. We all owe her a lot. And I also want to reiterate that I'm grateful to you all that you've taken the time out of your busy schedules. I thank you, and I wish you a good remainder of the day. Hope to see you soon in this or other formats. Have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.